the farm was something that was considered a big responsibility of the family. I remember my dad, the farmer, and there's several things that really ring home for me. Work came first, and sometimes you didn't get to anything else because work was first, and that's what you did, and sometimes that took most of your time. But I remember the detail that he would work on. I mean, he had a watering turn, and you had to make sure you got that water at a certain time. And that watering turn wasn't too long. He always had a certain amount of time, and you could cover all of his property in that watering turn, but you had to attend to the water. You had to make sure that it was properly managed, and he made sure we managed it. And he turned it over to us, but boy, if we didn't keep it managed right, he let us know real quick. And that was not proper, and that we should make sure that we do it properly. And the next person who was to get the water was to get it on time, and you were supposed to think through that process. Crops were rotated. He had a farm outside of town, and those crops were rotated according to the year that they needed to have the right nutrients. And many of the farmers in our area saw that my dad could raise a lot of crops on small acreage. And it was those Hiram farmers that I have fond memories of, Wallace Christensen and others who really tried to learn. And you know, my dad only had an 8th grade education, and I think about that sometimes, and I'm just amazed. I remember his cattle. He had some very good cattle. Tommy and I, I got an interest in the 4-H, and so we went to 4-H, and my dad, to help us accommodate that, would buy some purebred cattle. And then we had papered cattle. Before, they were just common cattle, I guess. But we got papered cattle, and then we started keeping track of their pedigrees, and Dad would read the flyers that would come from Cache Valley Breeders, and he'd study those flyers, Tommy. And he knew exactly what he wanted to breed that next cow to, because he wanted to get a better producing animal out of the next one. And he studied those in detail, 8th grade education. And he supported us all the way through that in 4-H and FFA, and I remember us taking on a testing program with the cattle so that he could monitor the butterfat and the amount of production. And he always had a high production level, and sometimes, I remember many times he was leading the state, and not in terms of the number of cows, but the amount of production per animal. He was always on top of it. So if you understand Jess Crookston, my father, you have to understand that he carefully thought out everything he did. And on the farm, it was in everything he did. And I often tell a story of the wagon. And I think the wagon of his farm tells so many stories. He had wagons. He built the wagons. He was one of the few people that could back a 4-wheel wagon. And Wallace, you know how hard that is. That's a difficult task. Some of you farmers know how difficult that is, but he could do it. And he built his own wagons, and I remember him having a definite way to haul hay. He was always planning exactly how he would rotate his crops, and that hay was stacked and presented to the barn in a certain way, so that every time a fork came down, you'd pick up 4 bales of hay, and every time a fork went up to the barn, it had 4 bales of hay on it. Now, you didn't put less than 4 bales of hay on it until you were to the end of the wagon, and then you were permitted to put 2 or whatever was left. But before that, you didn't send that hay fork up without 4 bales. That was my father. He thought through everything. And I didn't know too much about his building skills because a lot of it was running for tools for him, but he was a good builder, and the things that he built in his yard were very well constructed. And I remember several times working in the milk parlor, and people walking into the milk parlor and looking up at that ceiling, they say, "How did you do that?" Because he had a cement ceiling in that, concrete. And people would look at that in those days and try to figure that out. Now, Tom, you put one in your house for storage, and I know he did that with his panels that he used doing concrete work. Well, my dad didn't have any panels. And he must have done a complete understructure and poured that concrete and reinforced it, and I never, in all the time I worked in that barn, saw a crack or anything, and there must have been 20 or 30 ton of hay above him. And those are the kinds of things that he did. He thought through things very carefully and knew what he was doing. I remember the barn that we put up, he and I, in the mid-50s. He actually had heard from the first ward that I think a McBride was going to tear down a barn, and he asked him if he tore it out, whether he could have the material. And so we went over to the hay wagons and took every piece of board off that barn, loaded on the wagon, and hauled it over to our yard. And there we proceeded to hammer every nail out of there and to straighten every one that was straightenable. He then went downtown and bought some salvaged bands. And I don't know how many of you remember the bands that they used to put around the water canals. Well, he got these bands that have been sitting there probably for 10 years and were formed so that you couldn't move them. And he brought those bands up, and then we proceeded to straighten those bands out. And then we put that barn up, and we put the beams up, and I remember working with him on this, and we'd straighten those bands out, and then we'd run iron bars under each of the floors on that barn and reinforce that barn. So when Tom tried to tear that barn down, Marilyn, years later he wished he'd had dynamite. It was so well put together. And those are the kinds of things that I remember of him as a builder. And Marilyn tells me that and I wasn't there, but the story is definitely in the family of how he built his own home. Went up and, with his father, David, went up and got the logs, brought the logs down and built their home. And it was less than $2,000 that they built that home for. He went downtown and across from the square. This was during the Depression. They took the doors and the windows out of the home and put those in his home. It was out of a hotel that had been abandoned, and brought those up to the home and put them in his home. They learned to do a lot with a little, and that was something that really impressed me as I thought back on my father's life. And I